There are empires that fall to gunfire, and there are empires saved by someone who's never spoken a single word in her life. Close to midnight, in the wine cellar of an abandoned estate on the fog-drowned coast of Rhode Island, a 27-year-old maid named Delia Ward pushed her laundry cart across the cold stone floor, doing the invisible work she'd done for months, the kind of work that lets a woman disappear in a room full of powerful people. Delia was mute, born without a voice, though she could hear everything. The drip of water in the pipes, the hum of the old vernet, and, tonight, something else, a muffled, desperate sound behind a strip of duct tape, the sound of a man trying to scream through a sealed mouth. Following it, past the last row of dusty wine racks, she found him. A man of 37, an expensive suit torn at the shoulder, wrists bound behind a heavy oak chair with plastic zip ties, sweat soaking his collar, his cold gray eyes burning with a fury she'd never seen in any human being. She knew that face. Everyone in New England knew that face. Grayson Kane, the most feared crime boss on the eastern seaboard, a man who owned the harbors, the casinos, and half the people who pretended to be honest, was tied up like an animal in his own family's ruined estate. And the most terrifying part wasn't that someone had done this to a man that powerful. It was that Delia couldn't call the police. She couldn't scream for help. She couldn't say a single word. All she had was a laundry cart, a box cutter, 3 bottles of cleaning chemicals, and a mind that refused to break. So the real question is this: how does a woman who can't speak, can't cry out, and has no one at her side save the most dangerous man in the state, when whoever did this could walk back through that door at any second? If a story like this pulls you in, do us a quick favor, tap that like button, and share this with someone who loves a story that grips the heart. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you never miss what happens next. Your support is what keeps these stories alive, and it means more than words can say. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the morning everything changed for a silent woman the world had forgotten. That morning began, like every other morning, in the cramped third-floor apartment of an aging building in Providence's Olneyville neighborhood, where sunlight had to squeeze through the narrow gap between 2 buildings before it could reach the rickety dining table Delia Ward had pushed against the window so her mother could sit there and catch a little of the rare warmth of a New England spring. Delia had risen at 5 o'clock, as she always did, without needing an alarm because her body had long grown accustomed to the stillness of that hour, the kind of silence she understood better than anyone else in the world. She brewed a pot of weak tea, sliced the bread that had already begun to harden, then stepped into her mother's room, where Meredith Ward lay on her side on a low bed set close to the floor in case she rolled over and fell. Ever since the stroke 2 years earlier, the left side of Meredith's body had almost entirely stopped obeying her will. The corner of her mouth sagged, and her left hand had curled into a limp, yielding fist that Delia gently massaged every morning, straightening each finger one by one, exactly as she had learned to do during the unfinished semesters of nursing school she'd been forced to leave behind. Meredith could no longer say much, only a few broken, indistinct sounds, and in that moment, as mother and daughter looked at each other through the dim light of early morning, Delia saw a bitter truth she had never been able to speak aloud, even if she'd possessed the ability to speak, that both women in this apartment had now been robbed of their voices in their own separate ways, one from the moment she was born, the other from the fateful day a blood vessel ruptured inside her brain. On the table, the stack of medical bills grew thicker with every passing week, envelopes stamped with red overdue warnings that Delia had learned not to open right away, because she already knew that inside were only numbers larger than anything she earned: charges for physical therapy, for blood pressure medication, for the magnetic resonance imaging scan that insurance had covered only in small part. She worked as a contract housemaid for an upscale cleaning company called Bellhaven Domestic Services, a job she had fallen into not because it had ever been her dream, but because it was one of the few kinds of work willing to accept a woman who couldn't answer a telephone, couldn't speak during an interview, and could communicate only by writing on the small board she always carried at her hip. People hired her because she was cheap, because she was quiet, because she worked hard and never complained, and because in the magnificent estates where she scrubbed floors, her muteness became a convenience. For a servant who couldn't repeat what she overheard was a useful thing, though the truth was that Delia heard everything. Delia earned $14 an hour, sometimes a little more for a night shift, and she folded every dollar carefully and placed it inside a tin box hidden behind the rice in the kitchen cupboard, dividing the money into small portions for rent, for her mother's medicine, and for the debt that clung to her life like a shadow that refused to let go. Before leaving home that morning, she paused beside her mother's bed, took Meredith's good hand and pressed it against her cheek, and in her mind she heard the words her father, Thomas Ward, had repeated throughout the years before cancer took him away, words he used to write on scraps of paper and tape to the mirror in her room when she was a child crying because the other children had mocked her. Your silence isn't an emptiness, sweetheart. It's the place where you hear the things everyone else misses. She had grown up with those words and held on to them, like a rope, through the darkest days of her life. Though there were times when she was no longer certain, she still believed them, because the world beyond their apartment rarely rewarded those who listened. It rewarded only those who knew how to speak up, how to demand, how to push their way forward. Meredith looked at her daughter and struggled to lift the drooping corner of her mouth into something that almost resembled a smile. Then her good hand tightened gently around Delia's. A small squeeze they both understood as goodbye, as a warning to be careful, as everything a mother who could no longer speak wished to give a daughter who had never been able to speak at all. Delia pulled on her worn sweater, slung her bag over one shoulder, checked once more for the small writing board and marker in her coat pocket, then stepped out of the apartment and descended 3 flights of dark stairs, where the hallway light had burned out weeks earlier, and no one had bothered to replace it, before emerging onto the damp, misty street, where the city buses were beginning their first runs of the morning. She didn't know that the work message she had received the night before, assigning her to an unfamiliar address by the sea for a special shift, would make this the last morning her life would bear any resemblance to the one she had always known. And when she boarded the number 27 bus and took a seat beside the window, watching Providence drift past through a veil of gray fog, all she felt was the familiar weight of exhaustion. The exhaustion of a 27-year-old woman who had carried far too much on her shoulders, while not a single person had ever stopped long enough to truly see her. The number 27 bus carried Delia out of the heart of the city, passing through neighborhoods that grew more scattered with every mile, and then she transferred to another route that followed the coastline, where the road began to twist along the cliffs and salty gusts from Narragansett Bay struck the windows in restless waves. The address in the message from Belhaven Domestic Services led her to a place she had never set foot in before, an old estate standing alone on a headland that reached out into the sea, nearly a mile from the main road along a private drive, shaded by rows of ancient maple trees, whose branches intertwined overhead, forming a gloomy tunnel even in the middle of the day. When the company car met her at the final stop and carried her the rest of the way, Delia sat silently and watched the mansion slowly emerge through the lingering fog, an immense structure of gray stone built in an old-fashioned style, with tall, narrow windows like half-closed eyes, steep roofs darkened with moss, and an air of wealth faded by the passing years, yet still carrying such cold authority that people instinctively lowered their voices as they approached, though Delia had never possessed a voice to lower. The company's shift manager, a severe-faced woman named Corinne who spoke in quick, clipped sentences, had warned her by text the night before that this was a private event for a very important client, that she would be paid twice her usual rate for the shift, and that she would be required to obey a list of rules without exception. Rules Corinne had emphasized in stark capital letters, stating that she wasn't to look directly into the face of any guest, wasn't to enter any room with a closed door, wasn't to touch anything outside the specifically assigned areas, and above all, was to remain absolutely silent, a demand that sounded almost like a bitter joke to Delia, because silence was the one thing she had never needed to make an effort to maintain. When she stepped out of the car before the iron gates, a chill traveled down her spine for reasons she couldn't explain, perhaps because of the unnatural stillness surrounding the place, with not a single bird calling and not a gardener anywhere in sight. Only the steady sound of waves, striking the base of the distant cliffs, and the wind threading through the maple branches, like a series of long, weary breaths. At the Belhaven Estates, where she had worked several times before, The person who usually came out to meet her was a security guard named Foster, an older man with salt and pepper hair, who always made a habit of greeting her with a nod and opening the smaller gate so he could help her push her cleaning cart through. A man who never spoke much but always treated her with a quiet kindness that made her feel like a human being rather than a shadow. And on one occasion, Foster had hurriedly written on a scrap of paper and handed it to her, explaining that he had a granddaughter who was hard of hearing, his awkward way of letting Delia know that he understood. But Foster wasn't waiting at the gate that morning. In his place stood a man she had never seen before, taller and broader across the shoulders, dressed in a fitted black suit that stretched tightly over his upper arms, with a square, expressionless face and small eyes that traveled over her from head to toe, with the cold appraisal of someone deciding whether an object was worth his attention. And pinned to his chest was a plastic badge bearing the name R. Petrov, which she caught only a brief glimpse of before he turned and blocked her path. He didn't nod, didn't greet her, and didn't offer to help her as Foster always had, but merely jerked his chin for her to follow with a curt gesture, then strode around the building toward the servants' entrance, his leather shoes striking the gravel in steps so firm and evenly spaced that Delia found herself counting them inside her head. When he handed her a key card granting access to the permitted areas and gave her a few brief instructions about the day's schedule, Delia noticed that his eyes kept flicking toward the telephone resting in his palm, and there was something in the rigid vigilance of his posture, in the way he repeatedly glanced back toward the closed doors, that stirred a quiet note of unease in her instincts, something she couldn't yet name. She took out her small writing board, wrote a question asking whether Foster was there that day, and held it up for the man named Petrov to read. But he merely glanced at the words, one corner of his mouth, lifting in an expression that might have been amusement or contempt, then answered curtly that Foster no longer worked there before turning his back and walking away, leaving her alone in the dark corridor of the rear entrance, where the damp, musty smell of old stone mingled with another faint scent she couldn't recognize, and where the silence of the mansion began to gather around her like a heavy curtain, slowly drawing closed. A few miles south of where Delia stood, inside a high-floor office overlooking Providence Harbor, another man stood before a vast pane of glass and gazed down at the container cranes and the gray waters of the river, his hands clasped behind his back, and everything about his motionless posture radiated a kind of power that needed no display to be recognized. Grayson Kane was 37 years old, but his eyes belonged to a man who had lived through many lifetimes, cold and gray as the sea in March, and those who had ever dared to meet that gaze directly learned very quickly that behind his almost courteous composure lay a mercilessly calculating mind, an ability to make brutal decisions without so much as blinking. He had inherited this empire from his father, Warren Kane, who had built it from the docks and casinos along the New England coast with blood and with promises no one dared betray. And when Warren died, Grayson hadn't taken control through a peaceful succession, but by proving to every doubter that the son was even colder and sharper than the father had been. During his 10 years in power, Grayson had expanded the Kane family's influence into waterfront real estate, harbor transportation contracts, and streams of money that moved through dozens of layers of shell companies, so spotless that even the most hardened federal prosecutors couldn't find a way through them. And he had done all of it according to one unbreakable principle he repeated like a prayer: that loyalty was the only asset that could never be bought back once it had been lost. Yet for the past several months, that very principle had been tested in a way that robbed Grayson of sleep, because something was leaking from inside his empire. Information that only a handful of his most trusted people should have known was somehow reaching both federal authorities and rival organizations in Boston. A shipment intercepted at the harbor, whose schedule no one outside the inner circle should have possessed. A secret meeting placed under surveillance. A shell account, frozen only hours before the money could be moved. Grayson wasn't a man who panicked. He dealt with this threat the way he dealt with everything else, with cold patience, quietly narrowing the circle of suspicion. And during the long nights he spent alone in his study with a glass of whiskey without ice, he had formed in his mind a short list of names, people who had been beside him long enough and close enough to know the secrets now being stolen, a list that caused even him to feel the sting of an emotion he had believed no longer remained within him, because every name on it belonged to someone he had once trusted, someone with whom he had shared a table, someone into whose hands he had placed his life in moments of desperate danger. Some said Grayson Kane had no heart, that he had ordered things ordinary people wouldn't dare imagine. And most of those rumors weren't wrong, but what no one ever saw was the price he paid for every decision of that kind, the way each year of power wore away another small piece of the humanity left inside him, leaving behind a man of almost unimaginable wealth who was so profoundly alone that he could no longer remember the last time he had trusted someone without calculation. He had never married, and he had no friends in the sense ordinary people understood the word, only relationships measured by advantage and fear, and the one person for whom Grayson still held something close to genuine respect was his uncle Silvio Kane, his father's younger brother, a 68-year-old man who had withdrawn into the background long ago, but remained the advisor Grayson sought whenever he needed counsel given without self-interest, or at least that was what Grayson still believed. Standing before the glass and looking down at the harbor that morning, Grayson knew he couldn't allow the leak to continue any longer, that unless the rat inside his own house was dragged into the light, it would keep gnawing away until the entire legacy his father had left behind collapsed into ashes. And in his mind, a plan had already begun to take shape, a plan so daring and dangerous that only a man with absolute confidence in his ability to control every variable would have dared conceive it. A trap he would set with his own hands, using himself as the bait. The plan Grayson had been developing for weeks rested on a logic so simple it was chilling, that if he couldn't identify the rat through observation, he would force it to reveal itself by creating an opportunity too perfect to resist, and the most perfect opportunity any traitor could dream of was the moment Grayson Kane appeared weak and unprotected. And so he had constructed an elaborate performance with his own hands, a staged kidnapping in which he himself would play the hostage, taken to the family's old abandoned estate by the sea, where his father had spent the final years of his life, and where now there remained only a cold mass of stone that few people ever visited, a place isolated enough that anyone wishing to finish him once and for all would believe this was the kind of chance that came only once in a lifetime. The idea was to allow rumors to spread through channels he knew the rat was watching, rumors that he would be at the seaside estate that night without his usual security detail, that he would be there alone, except for a handful of people, and then he would arrange for himself to be overpowered and bound, as though it were a genuine abduction, all for the purpose of seeing who appeared, who made the telephone call to the rival faction, and who stepped forward intending to kill him once they believed he was completely helpless. Grayson believed in the plan with an absolute confidence that bordered on arrogance. Because every variable lay within his control, every piece had already been placed, and he had calculated even the smallest detail, from replacing the estate's entire familiar security team with new faces whose reactions he could observe, to positioning hidden watchers along every road leading onto the property. Only 2 people in the world had been told the truth about the plan, 2 men Grayson believed were beyond all suspicion. The first was his uncle Silvio Kane, whom Grayson had approached in the study one evening and told everything, and after a long silence, Silvio had nodded his approval, even offering several suggestions about how to make the performance appear more convincing, who should stand guard, and what hour of the night would be ideal for the trap to close. Advice Grayson accepted with the gratitude of a nephew, who had always regarded his uncle as the final remaining pillar of his family. The second person who knew was a young operative Grayson had promoted only recently, a man who hadn't served long enough to appear on the list of suspects, and who had therefore been chosen to handle the staging directly, the one who would bind Grayson at the proper moment, play the part of the kidnapper before the watching eyes of others, and wait for Grayson's signal to remove the restraints once the rat had been caught. What Grayson believed with unshakable certainty was that he wouldn't be in any real danger at any point, because he would always retain control, because a single coded signal would bring the entire performance to an end and summon his men to rush in, and because throughout his entire career, he had never once misjudged another human being so badly that the mistake could cost him his life. He had arranged for that night to be the night the trap finally closed, had chosen the seaside estate as the stage, had allowed the right amount of information to leak, and when twilight settled over Narragansett Bay, Grayson Kane stepped into the car that would carry him away from the city, with the calm expression of a man heading to an ordinary meeting, rather than deliberately placing himself inside a deadly wager whose outcome he believed was already secure in his hands. But there was one thing even Grayson Kane's cold and deeply suspicious mind hadn't accounted for. One variable absent from every calculation he had made: the presence of a silent cleaning woman who had also been sent to that same estate for the night. A person his world had never considered important enough to notice. And that small omission in a plan that seemed flawless would soon become the crack through which everything he had arranged began to slip beyond his control. Throughout the afternoon, and into the early hours of the evening, Delia quietly went about her work inside the mansion, pushing her cleaning cart through vast rooms with high ceilings and old carpets faded by time, wiping down polished surfaces of dark wood, sweeping long, seemingly endless corridors, where the sound of her broom rose briefly before disappearing into the dense stillness. And the longer she worked, the more strongly she felt that something about this place was unlike any private event she had ever served before. Mansions hosting evening gatherings were usually alive with voices, the clinking of glasses, music, and the smell of food drifting from the kitchen, but here everything was the opposite. The few guests she caught glimpses of left unusually early. They didn't linger to talk, and they didn't carry the relaxed air of people who had come to enjoy a party. Instead, they hurried toward their cars with quick steps and tense, guarded faces. Until shortly after 9 o'clock, the enormous house was left almost entirely empty, with only a few men in black suits stationed here and there near the entrances, men Delia had learned not to look directly at, just as she had been instructed. The man named Petrov appeared from time to time at the far end of a corridor, pacing back and forth with his telephone pressed to his ear, and whenever he noticed Delia, he watched her with a cold, searching stare, as though her presence were an inconvenience he hadn't yet decided how to handle. Once he even stepped into her path, pointed toward the door she had been about to clean near, and shook his head to forbid her from going any farther. A blunt gesture that made it clear there were parts of the mansion she was never to approach under any circumstances. Delia noticed that many of the doors throughout the building had been locked tight, with gleaming new locks hastily fitted onto old wooden panels, and beneath one of them she caught a brief glow of light and heard the low murmur of voices muffled behind the thick wood. Sounds her sensitive ears were able to separate from the silence, though not clearly enough for her to understand what was being said. All evening, the uneasiness that had first stirred inside her that morning continued to grow heavier, because she had spent her life in a world where information reached her through her eyes and ears, rather than through spoken words. And because of that, she noticed signs that ordinary people, too busy speaking and listening, might easily overlook. The way those men communicated with glances more often than with words. The way they kept checking their watches, and the tension stretched as tightly as a drawn wire, across a place that should have been filled with the ease of a peaceful evening. Close to 11 o'clock, when Delia had nearly finished her work on the upper floors and was putting her cleaning cart in order beside the service kitchen, Petrov approached and handed her a sheet of paper with a few hastily written instructions, stating that one final area had to be cleaned before she would be permitted to leave. The wine cellar buried deep beneath the mansion, and with an irritated expression, he made it clear that she was to finish quickly and get out at once. Delia took the key card he shoved into her hand, pushed her cart toward the narrow staircase leading underground, and the moment she began descending the cold stone steps, covered by a thin layer of dampness, she felt the temperature drop noticeably, while the air grew thick with the scent of old stone, fermenting wine, and a faint metallic odor that made her frown without understanding why. The farther down she went, the weaker the light became, until only a few bare round bulbs hanging at intervals from the low ceiling remained, casting a sickly yellow glow, and the wheels of her cart rolling across the stone floor, echoed with an unnatural loudness inside the sealed underground space. When she reached the final step and stopped before the heavy wooden door leading into the main wine cellar, she lifted her hand to swipe the key card, but suddenly froze with it suspended in the air, because through the narrow opening of the door, amid a silence only she could fully perceive, Delia's sensitive ears had caught a sound, something that wasn't dripping water or the groaning of pipes, but a small, choked, broken sound coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the door, and her entire body instantly went rigid when she realized it was the sound of a human being. Delia stood rooted before the partly open door for a long moment, her heart pounding so violently that it felt as though someone were hammering against her ribs from the inside. And the first instinct that rose within her was to turn around and run back up the stairs. But then that choked, broken sound came again, more urgent now, more desperate, and something in it reached all the way into the deepest part of her heart, because more than anyone else in the world, Delia understood what it felt like to have an entire storm of panic, struggling to escape, and yet be unable to make a sound, what it felt like to be imprisoned inside one's own body. She placed a hand against the heavy wooden door, gently pushed it farther open, then stepped into the dark wine cellar, where long rows of wooden racks crowded with dust-covered bottles stretched into the shadows, and following the sound, she made her way around the final rack before stopping abruptly, her entire body turning rigid at the sight revealed beneath the sickly yellow light. The man she had glimpsed in whispered rumors and on a few news reports, the man whose name alone was enough to make people lower their voices, was sitting there bound tightly to an oak chair, both wrists pinned behind his back, his mouth sealed with tape, and in the instant his cold gray eyes met hers. Delia saw in them not a plea for help but something far more complicated, fury, suspicion, and beneath it all, the sharp, calculating gaze of a man who was still weighing every possibility even in such a position. Delia staggered back a step, gripping the edge of the wine rack to keep her knees from giving way. And a command as clear as instinct immediately rang through her mind, the same command that would have come to anyone faced with such a scene. That she had to call the police, had to summon someone to rescue him, and her trembling hand was already reaching into her coat pocket for her telephone. The screen lit up, casting a pale glow across her bloodless face in the darkness, and her finger touched the emergency call symbol, those 3 familiar numbers every child in the country knew by heart, 911. But then her hand stopped halfway, and the cruel truth of her own life crashed over her like a bucket of freezing water. Because she could dial those 3 numbers, she could allow the call to connect, but what would happen after that? On the other end, an operator would ask what was happening, ask where she was, ask whether she needed help, and Delia would be able to do nothing but hold the telephone to her ear and listen to those questions in utter helplessness, unable to say even one word, unable to give the address, unable to describe what was happening, unable to call for help, until the person on the other end assumed it was a mistaken call or a prank and disconnected, while a man remained tied to a chair directly before her eyes. All 27 years of Delia's life seemed to compress into that single moment, becoming an aching pain sharper than anything she had ever felt before. The bitter contradiction that she, the only person here who had been able to hear the cry for help, the only person who had found this man, was also the one person incapable of making a sound to summon assistance. And in that instant, the silence that had followed her since birth ceased to feel like a familiar part of who she was, and became instead a towering wall of stone standing between her and the power to save a human life. She thought of sending a message, but to whom? Her mother was asleep by now and couldn't do anything, and even if Delia tried to message the police, she would have to type out everything that had happened, along with the address of a place whose exact location she herself didn't fully understand, and there was no knowing how long it would take them to reach this isolated headland by the sea, while the man named Petrov could return downstairs at any moment. Delia stood there amid the smell of fermenting wine and the sharp metallic tang in the air, the useless telephone trembling in her hand, her eyes filling with tears not because she feared for herself, but because of the crushing helplessness of someone who possessed enough courage to act and yet had been denied the simplest tool. Everyone else took for granted, and while Grayson Kane's cold gray eyes remained fixed on her above the tape sealing his mouth, Delia forced herself to draw one deep breath, forced her wildly beating heart to slow, because she understood that if no one else was coming to save him, then every decision that followed inside this cellar would have to come from her own silent hands. After standing there stunned for what felt like an eternity, Delia decided to do the only thing reason told her made sense in that moment: step closer and remove the tape from the man's mouth. because as long as he couldn't speak, she had no way of understanding what was truly happening in this place. She slipped her telephone back into her pocket and moved carefully across the cold stone floor. And when she came close enough to touch him, she saw those gray eyes narrow as they studied her with undisguised calculation, as though even while bound, he was still weighing whether this strange woman was a threat or an opportunity. Delia reached for the edge of the tape and tore it away in one decisive motion, and the instant air rushed freely into his lungs again. Grayson Kane drew a long, hoarse breath before speaking in a deep, dry voice that still carried all of its familiar cold authority, firing off a rapid series of blunt questions, asking who she was, what she was doing there, who had sent her, and whether anyone else had come with her. Delia stepped back half a pace, shook her head, then pointed to the maid's uniform she was wearing, and toward the cleaning cart she had left by the door, trying through the simplest gestures to make him understand that she was only there to clean. But Grayson watched her with unmistakable suspicion, because in his world there was no room for coincidence, and a woman who suddenly appeared in the very place where he was being held was a variable his distrustful mind immediately placed under suspicion. He ordered her in a low, forceful voice to untie him at once, not with the tone of a man begging for help, but with the voice of someone who had spent his entire life giving commands and assuming they would be obeyed. Yet when she didn't answer, didn't open her mouth, and simply stood there watching him with wide, tense eyes, his impatience shifted into a puzzled frown. Delia pulled the small writing board and marker from her pocket, quickly wrote a few words, then held it up before him beneath the sickly yellow light, explaining that she couldn't speak, that she was mute, and that she was only a cleaner hired to work there. And in the moment Grayson read those words, Delia saw something flicker across his cold face. Not pity, but a complete recalculation of the situation, because he had just realized that the woman standing before him hadn't been part of anyone's plan. That realization stunned Grayson in a way very few things in his life could still stun him, because he immediately understood that this silent woman's presence was entirely outside the script, a piece no player at the table that night had placed on the board, and that meant the performance he had constructed so carefully had just developed a fracture he had never anticipated. He studied her more intently, then, in a voice less harsh but still heavy with command, told her to cut him free and leave the estate immediately, that she didn't understand what she had become involved in, and that the longer she remained there, the greater the danger she faced. But Delia didn't obey at once, because countless questions were now surging through her mind, and she had no way to ask them quickly, and because something about the entire scene, about the men patrolling upstairs, about the way he issued orders while still studying her every reaction, told her instincts that nothing here was as simple as an ordinary kidnapping. She wrote another question, asking who the men upstairs were, and when Grayson read it, he fell silent for a moment, considering how much he should reveal to a stranger, before replying only that it was his business, and she didn't need to know, an answer intended to protect his secrets, but which inadvertently revealed that he knew exactly who those men were, and that evasiveness only deepened the suspicion growing inside Delia. She stood there with the utility knife she had just drawn from her pocket, making no move yet to cut a single rope, her eyes lifting toward the dark staircase where footsteps might begin descending at any moment, while inside her mind, a vague but persistent intuition began to take shape, warning her that she had accidentally stepped into the middle of something far larger and far darker than anything her eyes could see. Just as Delia was still hesitating with the utility knife in her hand, her sensitive ears suddenly caught a sound drifting down from the top of the stairs, the heavy footsteps of a man approaching the entrance to the cellar, and by instinct she immediately pressed herself into the darkness behind the final row of wine racks, drawing her natural silence around her like an invisible cloak, while signaling to Grayson with her eyes that he must remain still. The footsteps stopped halfway down the staircase, directly above the cellar, and then the familiar cold voice of the man named Petrov rang out, not speaking to anyone below but into his telephone, and in that sealed, echoing space every word fell with perfect clarity into Delia's ears, while Grayson sat farther away in the shadows, hindered by the sound of his own breathing and the distance between them, able to catch only scattered fragments that weren't enough to form any meaning. Delia heard everything, and what she heard seemed to freeze the blood inside her veins. Because Petrov was reporting to someone on the other end in the clipped tone of a man following orders, saying that everything was in position, that the target was still sitting quietly in the cellar and suspected nothing, and then he lowered his voice, cautiously confirming something as though even he believed. It went far beyond what had originally been agreed upon. He asked whether the other person was certain they wanted to go that far, said that this hadn't been part of the original plan, and after a pause, he nodded and replied that he understood, that if the boss wanted to change things, he would obey, that there would be no performance this time, no untying the prisoner and allowing everything to end quietly, that this would be real, that it would be final, and that he would personally make certain that by morning, the man in the cellar would no longer be anyone's problem. Delia stood frozen in the darkness, one hand instinctively covering her mouth even though she couldn't make a sound. And in that moment, the blurred picture her instincts had sensed throughout the evening suddenly assembled itself into a truth so clear it was horrifying, that this wasn't an ordinary kidnapping as she had believed, but something far more complicated that was now being twisted toward a deadly conclusion, that the man bound below was the true target of a conspiracy even he hadn't fully understood, and that whoever was on the other end of the call had just ordered that something originally intended to be false be transformed into a real execution. She didn't know who had given the order, because she couldn't hear the voice speaking only into Petrov's ear. But she understood enough to know that Grayson Kane's life was now being measured in hours, and what tightened her chest until she could barely breathe wasn't fear for herself, but the cruel contradiction closing around her once again, because she now possessed a secret capable of saving a human life. Vital information that anyone else could have conveyed with a single shout, with only a few spoken words. Yet she was the one person in the world who couldn't perform that simple act. She looked toward Grayson, seated in the sickly yellow light, a man powerful enough to terrify an entire region, yet now completely unaware of the blade hanging above his head, and she realized that she was carrying a terrible burden, the burden of someone who knew the truth but was sealed inside silence, and, unless she found some way to pass that truth to him, to warn him that his own plan had been turned against him and that someone he trusted had betrayed him, then every effort to cut him free or escape would be meaningless. Petrov's footsteps sounded again above them, this time retreating until they disappeared completely as he moved away from the cellar entrance, and, in the sudden stillness that returned, Delia stepped out of the darkness, with her heart pounding and a new determination hardening inside her, because she was no longer merely an accidental witness. She had become the only person capable of preventing a death that had already been ordered, and she knew she had very little time left to do it. Delia hurried back to Grayson, knelt until she was level with his eyes, and with hands that trembled slightly, turned her small writing board to the blank side, and quickly wrote a sentence, pressing the marker harder than usual, because urgency was driving every movement, telling him that the man upstairs had just called someone, and that they intended to kill him for real, that it wasn't pretend anymore. She held the board up before him, and in the moment Grayson read those words beneath the sickly yellow light, Delia witnessed something she suspected very few people had ever seen, shock appearing on the face of a man whose expression was usually as cold as stone, and who had spent his life controlling everything around him. His gray eyes widened slightly, his jaw tightened, and for a single instant, the constant air of calculated authority gave way to something close to pure bewilderment. He looked up at her, lowering his voice until it was almost a whisper, yet speaking with sharp urgency as he asked exactly what she had heard, what the man had said word for word, and Delia bent over the board again, trying to compress everything her ears had caught into a few brief lines, that the man had called the person on the other end boss, that he had asked whether they were certain they wanted to go that far, because this hadn't been part of the original plan, that he had said this time it would be real and there would be no performance, and that by morning Grayson would no longer be anyone's problem. Grayson read every word, and Delia clearly saw the instant the full meaning of those lines struck him like a blow, because he was the only person in the cellar who understood their true weight. He knew that the phrase "this hadn't been part of the original plan" could only have been spoken by someone who knew about the plan, and that plan was a secret he had shared with only 2 people in the entire world, which meant that the rat he had spent months hunting, the traitor he had built this elaborate trap to drag into the light, had been far closer than he had ever imagined. So close that the person stood among those he had trusted without reservation. The truth silenced Grayson, and in that silence Delia could see an entire storm gathering behind his gray eyes, the pain of a man who had just realized that his own hand had placed the knife into the grasp of the person preparing to stab him, the numbness of someone who had always taken pride in never misjudging another human being, and who now had to face the possibility that he had been wrong at the one point where the mistake could prove fatal. But Grayson Kane wasn't a man who allowed emotion to control him for long, and after only a few seconds, he forced all of it back inside, his gaze becoming colder and sharper than before. As he began rearranging every fragment beneath the new light of this truth, the replacement of the familiar security team, the suspicious ease with which everything had unfolded, and the fact that the very man entrusted with staging the performance was now preparing to make it real. He looked up at Delia with an expression entirely different from the one he had worn before. The suspicious scrutiny had given way to a cold, practical reassessment, because he had just realized that the silent woman kneeling before him, the person his powerful world had never considered worth noticing, was now the only source of information he possessed and the only possible ally he had inside that cellar. He didn't thank her, because gratitude wasn't instinctive to a man like him, but he spoke to her in a low voice filled with new urgency, telling her that everything had changed, that they didn't have much time, and that if she truly wanted both of them to leave this place alive, she had to cut him free immediately before the man upstairs returned. Delia nodded, tightened her grip on the utility knife, cast one quick glance toward the dark staircase, then bent down toward the plastic restraint biting tightly into the wrists of the most powerful man she had ever met. Delia moved behind the oak chair, where Grayson's wrists had been bound tightly together with a thick plastic restraint, a staged trap where Petrov, already executing Silvio's lethal orders, had intentionally cinched the plastic so deeply into his flesh that it left harsh impressions in his skin, completely cutting off his circulation and rendering him utterly helpless. And she realized at once that the task would be far more difficult than she had imagined, because there was almost no light in that corner. The utility knife in her hand was small, with a thin blade, and the plastic restraint was hard and slick, threatening to slip away every time she tried to work the blade beneath it. She leaned closer, feeling her way with fingertips that had begun to go numb from the cold, guided the blade into the tiny space between the restraint and his wrist, and began sawing through it one careful stroke at a time, fully aware that a single slip could drive the edge into his flesh, but that very caution made the work proceed with maddening slowness, while every passing second carried the crushing fear that Petrov might return. Grayson remained perfectly still, straining his wrists apart to create as much room as possible for her to work, and through clenched teeth he whispered that she should remain calm and take her time, a rare show of patience from a man accustomed to giving orders, but the pressure of time forced Delia to move faster, and just as she applied more force to finish cutting through the restraint, which was already nearly severed, her hand shifted slightly in the darkness, and the blade skimmed across the inside of his wrist, opening a line in his skin. Grayson drew a sharp breath through his teeth, a small reaction he immediately suppressed, and Delia froze in alarm when she felt warm moisture seep across her fingertips. She quickly released the knife and started to pull her hand away, but Grayson gave a slight shake of his head and told her in a low, forceful voice not to stop, that it was only a minor scratch, and that she needed to finish cutting, because they didn't have time to worry about small wounds. Delia drew a steadying breath, pressed her lips together, then returned the blade to the restraint and pulled through the final stroke with determination, and the plastic tie snapped apart with a soft crack, freeing the wrists that had been bound for hours. But freedom didn't bring the relief she had expected, because when Grayson tried to bring his hands around to the front, his arms barely obeyed him. They were numb and rigid after being held in one position for so long, and as the blood rushed back, thousands of piercing needles of pain spread through them, leaving him unable even to close his hands into fists. And when he tried to stand, his legs betrayed him as well, his knees buckling beneath him and sending him reeling forward, nearly falling from the chair. Delia lunged toward him by instinct, slipping one arm beneath his to keep him from collapsing onto the stone floor. And in that unexpected moment, two strangers from worlds that couldn't have been more different suddenly found themselves leaning against each other in the darkness of the cellar. The most powerful man in the region forced to rest nearly all his weight upon the narrow shoulders of a maid he wouldn't even have considered worth noticing only a few hours earlier. Grayson felt the unexpected steadiness in the way she supported him. She wasn't panicked or clumsy, but moved with the precise, decisive control of someone who seemed to know exactly how to support a body that had lost command of itself. And although he didn't yet know that she had once studied nursing, even then he understood that these silent hands were far more dependable than he had first believed. Delia pulled a clean cloth from her apron and quickly wrapped it around his bleeding wrist, tying it neatly to stop the blood, a practiced gesture that made Grayson glance at her with fresh surprise. And while she worked, he forced his fingers to bend and straighten in an effort to awaken them, grinding his teeth against the painful tingling spreading through both arms. They both understood that they hadn't escaped the danger, that this was only the first step and the hardest part still lay ahead, that above them stood an entire mansion filled with men sent to keep watch, and a man who would soon return with the intention of killing. But in that brief moment, as Delia helped Grayson steady himself on legs that were slowly beginning to recover, something unspoken was established between them. Not complete trust, because a man like Grayson didn't surrender his trust so easily, but a reluctant acknowledgement that here, inside this dark cellar, both their lives had become bound together, and neither of them had any choice but to depend upon the other if they hoped to survive. With Grayson still unsteady, and leaning partly against her, Delia understood that they couldn't go back up the main staircase, where Petrov might appear at any moment, so she swept her gaze across the cellar in search of another way out. And the memory of a cleaner who had noticed every corner told her that old cellars like this often had a secondary service passage leading toward the kitchen, a narrow corridor she had briefly glimpsed when she first came downstairs. She helped him move along the stone wall toward the far end of the wine racks, and on the way, her eyes stopped on the cleaning cart she had left behind, an object that seemed useless at first, but instantly became something valuable in Delia's mind, because it carried the industrial cleaning chemicals she used every day. Bottles of liquid she knew could leave a charging attacker blinded and writhing in pain for a few precious seconds if sprayed directly into his eyes. And she quickly picked up the two strongest bottles, released their safety locks, tucked one into the waistband of her apron, and kept the other ready in her hand as an improvised weapon. Grayson watched her with a new expression, because he was a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by guns and violence, yet had never considered that a bottle of glass cleaner could become a means of defense. And he began to understand that this silent woman possessed a kind of practical, unsentimental ingenuity that even his most experienced men might not have had, the ingenuity of someone who had learned to survive by observing and making use of the smallest things within reach. They followed the narrow, pitch-dark service passage, with Delia pushing the cleaning cart ahead of them as a moving shield, and also as something Grayson could grip whenever his still numb legs threatened to buckle. And every few steps she stopped to press her ear against the cold wall and listen to the sounds traveling through the stone, her sensitive hearing now becoming an early warning system more valuable than any device, allowing her to estimate where the footsteps above them were moving. At a bend in the corridor, she suddenly raised one hand and signaled Grayson to stop at once, pulling them both into a dark recess in the wall, because she had just heard Petrov's leather shoes striking the steps from the kitchen staircase, his footsteps drawing so near that Delia could feel her pulse pounding against her temples. And during those breathless seconds, the man passed the mouth of the corridor only a few yards from where they were hiding, his telephone still pressed to his ear, completely unaware that the target he believed remained tied in the cellar was now standing almost beside him in the darkness. Only when Petrov's footsteps began to fade did Delia dare breathe again, but she noticed that Grayson beside her was breathing much faster and more heavily than before, his face pale and covered with cold sweat, and when she placed a hand against his forehead, she found his skin cool and damp, signs that her unfinished nursing education immediately recognized as exhaustion. and possibly the early onset of shock caused by dehydration and prolonged stress after hours of restraint. She helped him sit on the corridor floor and rested his back against the wall, then motioned for him to lower his head and slow his breathing, movements she carried out with the calm precision of someone who had once been trained to handle exactly such a situation. And from the cleaning cart, she took the small bottle of water she always carried, opened it, and held it to his lips so he could drink in careful sips. Grayson allowed her to care for him, and that surrender was the strangest thing of all, because a man who had spent his entire life refusing to appear weak before anyone was now placing his very survival in the hands of a stranger who couldn't speak a single word. And as his breathing gradually steadied under her silent guidance, he looked up at her and asked in a hoarse voice where she had learned to do all of this, a question Delia didn't have time to answer on her board. She only shook her head slightly to tell him later, then helped him to his feet again, because they both understood that stopping for too long anywhere inside this mansion meant death, and they still had a long and dangerous path ahead before they could reach even the faintest hope of freedom. As she helped Grayson into a safer recess at the end of the corridor, Delia took out her telephone once more, and this time she looked at the screen with a different thought in mind, because she realized that calling would be useless, but sending a message might work, and suddenly she remembered a card she had kept in her wallet for several months. A card she had received during an information session at a community center for people with disabilities near the neighborhood where she lived, where people with speech and hearing impairments had been introduced to an emergency text, line, and messaging application that allowed them to contact authorities in writing, instead of by voice. She vaguely remembered that the card bore the name and contact information of a federal agent assigned to a witness protection and victim assistance program, a woman named Nadia Beaumont, whose name Delia had saved in her telephone back then, without ever imagining that the day would come when she might need it. And now, in the darkness of this cellar, that name suddenly became the only fragile thread connecting her to the outside world. With fingers that trembled yet remained decisive, Delia opened the messaging application and began typing as quickly as she could, trying to compress everything that mattered into the fewest possible lines. That a man was being held captive and was about to be killed at an old seaside estate, that she was mute and couldn't make a telephone call, that she was trapped inside with the victim, and she tried to describe the location with everything she knew. The name of the coastal road the car had traveled, the gray stone mansion standing on a headland that extended into the sea. Then she activated her telephone's location service and attached the coordinates to the message, hoping they would be accurate enough to lead someone to the right place. She pressed send, and during the breathless seconds that followed, while the message icon continued spinning, because the signal in this isolated place was so weak, Delia nearly stopped breathing, until a small checkmark finally appeared to confirm that the message had gone through, and a faint spark of hope flickered to life inside her chest. Many miles away, inside a federal office in the center of the city where the lights remained on, despite the late hour, Agent Nadia Beaumont, a woman in her 40s with short black hair and many years of experience investigating organized crime, received the message through the emergency response system overseen by her unit, and her first reaction wasn't immediate belief, but the professional caution that had long since become part of her blood, because lines like this regularly received every kind of message imaginable, from genuine reports to cruel pranks, empty threats, and accidental contacts, and a message from an unfamiliar number claiming to belong to a mute woman, witnessing an impending murder at a vaguely described coastal location, carried all the signs of something difficult to verify. Beaumont read the message several times, frowning at the urgency in every sentence, while remaining fully aware that she couldn't mobilize an entire force on the strength of a single unconfirmed message. And following procedure, she marked it as unverified and under review, while quietly beginning a trace on the telephone number that had sent it and comparing the attached coordinates with maps of the coastal area to determine whether the location truly existed. Since Beaumont's unit had already been building a secret file on Silvio's suspicious movements for months, this precise distress signal from an unknown mute witness was the final, undeniable proof she needed, prompting her to immediately activate the full emergency response protocol and coordinate with local patrols already stationed near the coastal highway to close in on the coordinates without losing a single second, which meant that while she also dispatched a vehicle carrying 2 agents in that direction, as an initial precaution, separated from Delia and Grayson by an amount of time that, under their circumstances, could make every passing minute the boundary between life and death. Delia, of course, had no way of knowing everything taking place at the other end of the connection. She knew only that she had done the one thing within her power, had cast a plea for help out into the darkness, and now could only pray that it would fall into the right hands. And when she put her telephone away and turned back toward Grayson, she found him watching her with a questioning look. She immediately raised the board on which she had already written that she had managed to contact a federal agent, and Grayson gave a slight nod, but in the cold practicality of his gaze, Delia read what she herself already understood, that they couldn't remain there, waiting for a rescue that might not arrive in time, and that if they wanted to survive, they would still have to find their own way out of this place. They had barely reached the end of the service corridor, where a narrow staircase led up to the secondary kitchen, and from there could take them around to the rear exit, when a voice sounded from above the stairs and made them both stop as though frozen in place. A calm, familiar voice that caused Grayson to react more sharply than Delia, because it wasn't the voice of the curt and brutal Petrov, but the voice of a man he had trusted for 10 long years. From the dim pool of light at the top of the staircase, a figure stepped forward at an unhurried pace, and when the light fell across his face, Delia felt Grayson's entire body turn rigid beside her, his gray eyes widening not with fear but beneath the crushing weight of a betrayal beyond anything he had imagined. Because the man standing there with one hand resting casually in his trouser pocket was Emmett Vaughn, his most trusted right-hand man, the advisor he had regarded almost as a younger brother, the only person besides Uncle Silvio whom he had once believed completely incapable of betraying him. Vaughn looked down at the two of them standing in the shadows, with a smile that seemed more sorrowful than triumphant, then spoke to Grayson in a voice that was almost intimate in its calmness, telling him that he had known about the staged kidnapping plan from the very beginning, that he had anticipated every move Grayson would make, because he had spent all those years learning everything from Grayson himself, and that the trap Grayson believed he had designed to catch the rat had actually been turned against him and transformed into the trap that would finally end his life. Grayson demanded to know why, a single word breaking from his hoarse throat, and in that moment, Delia witnessed something unexpected, because the question seemed to touch a wound buried deep inside Vaughn, his face tightening briefly and his voice cracking slightly as he spoke a name, the name of his younger brother, a young man who had died many years earlier, during an operation Grayson himself had ordered. An operation Grayson had always believed was an unavoidable accident of their work, but which Vaughn saw as the sacrifice of a human life, cast aside like a worthless piece on a board. With a trembling voice held tightly under control, Vaughn told him that for all those years he had stood beside Grayson, smiling, serving, remaining loyal, while inside himself he had fed the grief of losing the brother he had promised their dying mother he would protect, that he had waited year after year for this exact moment, the moment when Grayson would be utterly helpless and forced to understand that the man bringing him down was the person he had trusted most, because to Vaughn, a quick and painless death wouldn't be enough. He wanted Grayson to taste what it meant to be betrayed by the person closest to him, to feel the same torment Vaughn had carried in his heart through all those years. He even admitted, with a chilling laugh, that Foster, the kind old guard Delia had looked for, had been quietly forced into early retirement weeks ago, paid off and sent far away just to clear the path for Petrov. Delia stood in silence and listened to every word, and although she couldn't speak, although she was an outsider to the tragedy between these two men, she could still feel the weight of pain in Vaughn's voice, and it made the entire situation far more complicated than a simple confrontation between good and evil, because she understood that the traitor standing before them wasn't a cold-blooded monster, but a man whose grief and hatred had consumed him until he had become distorted beyond recognition, a man who had once known love and loyalty, but had been shaped into an instrument of vengeance by the same merciless world to which both men belonged. Grayson fell silent beneath those words, and Delia saw something exceedingly rare pass across his face. Not fear, but a faint and uncertain regret, as though for the first time in many years he was being forced to confront the true human cost of the cold decisions he had made in the past. And perhaps it was in that very moment, when he stood face to face with the living consequence of a life he had once sacrificed, that the first seed of awakening was planted inside this ruthless man. But Vaughn gave them no more time for reflection. He gestured behind him, and Petrov stepped from the shadows with another man, blocking the only remaining escape. And when Vaughn drew a gun from inside his coat and held it ready in his hand, his voice returned to its cold, decisive tone as he said that it was time to end everything. In that perilous moment, Delia understood that the door of hope that had barely opened had now slammed shut again, that rescue from the outside was still far too distant, and that the fate of both herself and the man beside her now depended entirely upon what they could do in the few brief moments ahead. In that moment, with the tension drawn as tight as a wire, Delia realized something neither Vaughn nor Petrov had considered, that throughout the entire confrontation, not one of them had truly seen her as a threat. All three men had fixed their attention on Grayson, their real enemy, while she was merely the silent maid standing beside him. A harmless accessory in a scene they had already decided wasn't worth noticing, and that very contempt, that invisibility she had carried through her entire life like a wound, suddenly became the only advantage she possessed. Vaughn ordered Petrov to move forward and drag Grayson to his feet, and as the large man approached, everyone's attention remained focused on the figure leaning against the wall. No one noticed Delia quietly slipping one hand toward the waistband of her apron, where she had tucked the bottle of cleaning solution she had taken from the cellar, her fingers closing around it and settling over the spray nozzle, while her face retained the frightened, submissive expression of someone who had surrendered to her fate. She waited until the precise moment Petrov bent down and seized Grayson's arm, when the distance between them had narrowed to little more than arm's reach, and then, with one swift and decisive movement, she raised the bottle and sprayed the harsh chemical directly into his eyes. Petrov screamed in agony, released Grayson, and staggered backward with both hands covering his face as the burning pain left him completely disoriented in the narrow corridor. The sudden chaos lasted only a few seconds, but those few seconds were all Delia needed. She immediately shoved her heavy cleaning cart straight toward Vaughn, just as he spun the gun in her direction, and the cart slammed into him, throwing him off balance while the first shot went wide and buried itself in the stone wall with a deafening crack that filled the enclosed space and sent fragments of dust flying through the air. Delia had no illusion that she could overpower armed men through strength. She knew perfectly well that she was only a small woman with a handful of cleaning supplies, and she didn't suddenly become some extraordinary warrior in that moment. Everything she did was simply an attempt to use surprise and the ordinary tools in her hands to create enough confusion for herself and Grayson to have a chance, and she grabbed his hand and pulled him into a stumbling run toward the staircase leading to the kitchen, while behind them, Vaughn struggled back to his feet and shouted orders, and Petrov remained half-blinded, clutching his face. Grayson was still weak, but instinct and years of surviving dangerous encounters helped him force his body to follow her, and when they finally burst into the dark secondary kitchen with its cold steel counters, Delia searched quickly for a way out and pulled him along the row of cabinets toward the door leading outside, but she could clearly hear Vaughn's footsteps closing in behind them, and his furious voice ordering the remaining man to block the front exit. Even as she ran, Delia's mind continued working with cold clarity. She understood that they couldn't outrun their pursuers while Grayson remained so weak, and that their only hope was to keep creating obstacles, so as they crossed the kitchen, she swept a steel rack of pots and pans onto the floor behind them. The cookware rolled and crashed across the tiles in a deafening mess that forced Vaughn to stop and avoid it. And then she reached for another bottle of solution. From the cleaning cart she was still pushing, and poured the slick liquid across the narrow stretch of floor behind them to slow anyone trying to follow. Every action came from the immediate improvisation of a mind accustomed to surviving from a position of weakness. Nothing elegant, nothing heroic, only small pieces of resourcefulness stitched together in desperation, yet those pieces were buying them each precious second, and every precious minute they needed. When Delia finally managed to push the kitchen's side door partly open, and the freezing night air rushed inside, with the distant sound of waves rolling in from the sea, a fragile spark of hope flared within her, though she understood at once that the most dangerous part still lay ahead, and that Vaughn would never allow them to walk easily out of the mansion, after waiting so many years for this moment of revenge. The side door had barely opened onto the stone-paved courtyard leading down through the garden toward the sea cliffs, when the night air rushed against Delia's face, and by instinct she hurried outside, pulling Grayson with her. But they had taken only a few steps when his knees gave way, his exhausted legs no longer able to support the weight of his body, and he collapsed onto the cold stone, gasping for breath, his face pale beneath the faint moonlight. Delia bent down and tried to pull him back to his feet, but he shook his head, and with what little strength he had left, he told her in a faint, broken voice to run, to leave him behind and save herself, that she had already done far more than anyone could have expected, that there was no reason for a stranger to die beside him, that she should reach the main road and find help while he took care of himself. In that moment, Delia slowly straightened, and before her stood a choice, stripped bare in all its cruelty, because she knew that if she ran now, if she crossed the dark garden alone and followed the coastal road, then with her speed and strength, she had a real chance of escaping and surviving. She could return home, hold her mother in her arms, and continue the quiet life she had always lived, and no one in the world could blame her for leaving a stranger behind in mortal danger, a man society called a criminal, someone she hadn't even known only a few hours earlier. Behind her, through the kitchen doorway, she could clearly hear Vaughn's footsteps drawing closer, and the sound of his angry shouts, and every passing second was closing the door to her escape. Reason screamed inside her to run, that this wasn't her battle, that she had a disabled mother waiting for her at home, and that she had no right to throw away her life for a stranger. But when Delia looked down at the man lying at her feet, when she saw that his gray eyes had been emptied of all authority, and now held only the exhaustion of a human being on the verge of surrender, something rose within her that was stronger than fear, and stronger than the instinct to survive. It was the silent principle that had shaped her throughout all 27 years of her life, the belief her father had planted within her, that a person's worth wasn't measured by whether they possessed a voice, but by what they chose to do when no one forced them to do what was right. And she understood that if she ran now, she might live, but she would live with the hollow place left by the one time she had turned away, the one time she had heard a cry for help and chosen to cover her ears. She thought of every moment in her life when people had looked through her as though she didn't exist, when they had treated her like an invisible shadow, simply because she couldn't speak, and she realized that because she understood so deeply what it meant to be abandoned by the entire world, she couldn't abandon another human being at the darkest edge of despair, no matter who he was or what he had done, and so Delia made her choice, a choice born not from reckless heroism, but from the deepest core of her human dignity. She knelt beside Grayson, slipped her shoulder beneath his arm once more, and with every fragment of strength remaining in her small body, struggled to lift him back to his feet, her steady eyes holding his, as though telling him that she wouldn't leave him behind, that if they escaped, they would escape together, and if they didn't, they would face the same fate together. Grayson looked up at her, and in the eyes of a man who had once coldly ordered 100 merciless things, something stirred for the first time that had perhaps been dry and lifeless for many years, a genuine emotion so powerful that it caught in his throat, because throughout a lifetime spent among people who remained loyal only because of money and fear, no one, not a single person, had ever been willing to risk their life to remain beside him without asking for anything in return. And now the person making that choice was a silent young woman whose name his world had never even considered worth remembering. He forced himself upright with her support, and together they began taking slow, painful steps toward the dark garden and the distant sound of the sea, one carrying the other, two people from worlds separated by an immeasurable distance, whose fates were now bound together in the darkness, carrying with them the fragile hope that one woman's quiet courage might be enough to lead them both across the final boundary between life and death. They had barely managed to stagger halfway across the dark garden when Vaughn burst through the kitchen door behind them, with his gun raised, his cold voice ordering them to stop. But at the very moment when all hope seemed extinguished, the entire seaside property suddenly blazed beneath dazzling headlights, and the roar of engines as a convoy of federal vehicles surged up the private drive, red and blue lights flashing through the maple branches, while firm voices thundered over loudspeakers, ordering everyone to drop their weapons and remain where they were. The patrol vehicle Agent Nadia Beaumont had dispatched earlier had reached the property and confirmed that the location was real, and, the moment its officers reported the suspicious signs they had observed, she had immediately elevated the situation to a full emergency, and personally led a team of armed federal agents racing toward the estate, and the fragile message sent by a mute woman had now become the very thing that saved their lives. Vaughn spun around toward the headlights, tightening their circle around him, and for a fleeting moment Delia saw on his face not the panic of a man about to be arrested, but the bitterness of someone who had just realized that the moment of vengeance he had awaited for so many years had slipped from his grasp at the final second. He lowered the gun and let it fall to the ground as the agents rushed him, forced him down, and locked his wrists behind his back, while Petrov, whose eyes were still red and streaming from the chemicals, was dragged from the kitchen without enough strength left to resist. Beaumont approached quickly, her gaze sweeping over the scene before settling on Grayson, who was sagging against Delia, and she immediately ordered medical assistance, and amid the chaos of handcuffs, flashing lights, and shouted commands, it seemed that everything had finally been decided, the traitor captured and the victim saved, until Vaughn, as he was led past Grayson, lifted his head and spoke a sentence that shattered the entire picture everyone believed they understood. He stared directly at Grayson with a twisted, bitter smile, and told him that even now he was still naive enough to believe Vaughn had arranged all of this alone because of his own private hatred, that he should ask himself who had spent years reopening the wound of his brother's death, who had poured every detail of that loss into his ear, who had supplied him with the inside information needed to turn the plan against Grayson, and who had manipulated everything from the shadows while waiting for the day Grayson fell so that the entire empire could be seized. Then Vaughn spoke the name, and when it reached Grayson's ears, the already exhausted man staggered as though he had suffered a fatal blow to the deepest part of his soul. The name was Silvio Kane, his own uncle, the man Grayson respected and trusted more than anyone still alive, the one person he had believed was the final pillar holding his family together. Silvio was the one who had used Vaughn's hatred like a blade held in another man's hand. He was the one who had known every detail of the staged kidnapping, because Grayson himself had told him the entire plan. And he was the one who had quietly twisted that trap into a real assassination, clearing the way for an ambition to seize absolute power that he had concealed for years beneath the mask of a gentle uncle who had withdrawn from the world. Standing beside him, Delia felt the full weight of that betrayal pass through Grayson's body as he leaned against her. She felt him tremble, not from the cold but from a pain more devastating than any physical wound, because betrayal by an old enemy was one thing, but betrayal by the final blood relative he loved and trusted was an entirely different abyss. And in that moment, Delia understood that this powerful man had just lost something even more precious than his empire, the last remaining faith he possessed in another human being. Beaumont, who had quietly investigated the Kane family for years and already had sources planted inside its organization, immediately recorded Vaughn's explosive statement and ordered her team to verify it without delay, because she understood that if what he had said was true, then the largest figure in the entire case was still walking freely beyond the reach of the law. And as the medical team helped Grayson onto a stretcher, he continued looking back at Delia, with eyes filled with everything he couldn't put into words, the gaze of a man whose entire familiar world had just collapsed beneath his feet, yet who had found among its ruins a stranger who had proven to him that unconditional goodness still existed in this world. The weeks following that night passed beneath a quiet shock that spread throughout the criminal underworld of New England, because no one had anticipated that the Kane Empire would come so close to collapsing from within, and once the machinery of the law began to move, it swept up everyone connected to the conspiracy. Emmett Vaughn was charged with a long list of serious crimes, including conspiracy to commit murder, unlawful imprisonment, and numerous other offenses connected to the organization's illegal activities. And during his interrogations, he made no attempt to deny what he had done. Instead, he confessed to everything with the exhaustion of a man who had finally laid down the burden of hatred that had crushed him for so many years, even though the price of that release would be the rest of his life behind bars. Roland Petrov was also arrested and charged as an accomplice, and his testimony, combined with the evidence gathered by Agent Beaumont's team, gradually formed a complete picture that pointed directly toward the true mastermind. Not long afterward, on a quiet morning, federal agents appeared at the door of the luxurious estate where Silvio Kane had continued to live in seclusion, and the 68-year-old man who had spent so many years playing the role of a kindly uncle was led away in handcuffs before the cameras, bringing an end to a plan to seize power that he had secretly nurtured for years. Nadia Beaumont, who had pursued the case with patience from the faintest and most fragile clues, finally obtained what her unit had been seeking for so long, not merely a single link, but an entire network exposed to the light. And in the official case file, she recorded the decisive role played by an extraordinary witness, a woman whose silent plea for help had prevented the truth from being buried forever beneath the sea along with its intended victim. As for Grayson Kane, he remained in the hospital for several days, while recovering from exhaustion and his injuries. His wrist was stitched where Delia's blade had accidentally cut him that night, leaving behind a thin scar that would later remind him, every time he looked down, of the hands that had severed his restraints. During the long days he spent alone in a hospital bed, with more time to think than he had ever allowed himself before, the man who had never permitted himself to stop and look inward was forced to confront the person he had become, in a way he had avoided throughout his entire life. He thought of Vaughn, of the grief over his younger brother that Grayson himself had caused, and then forgotten, as though it were nothing more than an insignificant detail in a business ledger, of the way one life he had sacrificed had slowly smoldered into a fire of hatred that ultimately consumed them both, and for the first time, he truly felt the moral weight of the cold decisions he had once regarded as proof of his strength. He thought of Uncle Silvio, of the betrayal committed by the last member of his family, and he realized bitterly that the world he had devoted his life to conquering was, in truth, a world with no room for genuine loyalty, a world where every relationship was eaten away by ambition and fear, where even blood could become the knife that struck from behind. Yet what moved Grayson most deeply, what returned to him again and again during the sleepless nights in the hospital, wasn't any of those betrayals, but the image of a silent young woman kneeling beside him in the dark garden, and choosing to remain rather than run. She owed him nothing, didn't fear him, expected nothing from him, and had every justifiable reason to turn away and leave him to die. Yet she had become the only person in his entire life to offer him kindness that was completely unconditional. He realized that for years he had measured human worth through power, money, and usefulness, that he had looked upon people like Delia, the quiet workers who served around him, as though they were invisible parts of the scenery rather than human beings, with dignity and courage of their own, and the person he ordinarily wouldn't have considered, worth a second glance, had taught him the greatest lesson of his life, without speaking a single word. The seed of awakening planted inside that cellar had now begun to grow into something larger within the man. So many people believed had no heart, not allowed repentance or an empty promise to transform his life, but a quiet and profound shift in the way he began to reconsider everything he had once believed mattered. And for the first time in many years, Grayson Kane found himself wondering whether there was still enough time for a man like him to become someone better. 4 months had passed since the night at the seaside estate, and Delia's life had gradually returned to its familiar quiet rhythm. She still cared for her mother every morning, still accepted cleaning shifts through the company, and still rode the same buses through the streets of Providence. Yet something inside her had changed, a silent steadiness she couldn't yet name, as though that night had revealed something about herself she had never before dared to believe. One July afternoon, with golden sunlight stretching across the narrow street, Delia returned to the apartment after work and found a thick ivory envelope in the building's mailbox. Not another familiar bill stamped with a red warning, but a real letter, enclosed in fine paper with her name carefully written by hand across the front, and when she turned it over, There was no sender's name, only a simple seal. She carried the letter upstairs, sat at the dining table beside the window where her mother often rested, and opened the envelope with fingers that trembled slightly. Inside was a sheet of heavy paper folded in half, along with several accompanying documents. And when she unfolded the letter and read the lines written in blue ink, in the firm and decisive handwriting of a man, she knew at once who had sent it, even before reaching the signature. The letter said that throughout his life, he had been accustomed to measuring people by what they could give him or take from him, accustomed to seeing the world as a chessboard, where every person was merely a piece whose worth depended upon its usefulness. But that night in the cellar, someone whom the rules of his world had given him no reason to notice had taught him something that 40 years among power and fear never had. That true kindness didn't need a voice to be heard, and that her silence that night had spoken to him more powerfully than every oath of loyalty he had ever heard in his life. He wrote that he had once believed he understood courage, until he watched a woman who possessed nothing and owed him nothing choose to turn back instead of running away. And that moment had forced him to confront the man he had become and ask himself whether there was still time to change. Enclosed with the letter were documents that made Delia's hands begin to shake in earnest as she turned through them, because they confirmed that every dollar of her mother's accumulated medical debt, the burden that had weighed upon her shoulders for years and had seemed impossible ever to repay, had been settled in full by an anonymous benefactor. Beside them was an application for a full nursing scholarship, issued by a charitable foundation she had never heard of, with a handwritten note in the margin, explaining that the scholarship had been reserved for her should she choose to return to the path she had once been forced to abandon. Delia read the letter again and again, and by the third time, the words had begun to blur before her eyes, not because the debt was gone or because of the scholarship, but for a reason far deeper that tightened her chest and sent tears streaming silently down her cheeks, because for the first time in all 27 years of her life, another human being had truly seen her, not as a disabled young woman deserving pity, not as an invisible servant, but as a person with strength, courage, and dignity. Beside her, Meredith slowly made her way across the room, leaned over her daughter's shoulder to read the letter, and placed her good hand upon Delia's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. Then, through the difficult, distorted sounds that only Delia could understand, she tried to repeat the very words her husband, Delia's father, had spoken to their daughter so many times when she was a child that she didn't need a voice to have a voice of her own, and this time, as those words filled the small room bathed in afternoon sunlight, Delia no longer merely tried to believe them. She truly believed them with all her heart, because she finally understood that her voice had never lived in her throat, but in the things she chose to do when no one required her to do what was right. That autumn, Delia Ward walked through the gates of the nursing school she had once been forced to leave years earlier, but this time she carried herself with an entirely different spirit, no longer a young woman whose dream had been crushed beneath the burdens of life, but a woman who had come to understand her own worth. And when she took her seat in the lecture hall, with a notebook in her hands and the familiar little writing board at her side, she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would still be people who looked at her with doubt when they saw a nursing student who couldn't speak. But she also knew that she had once cared for another human being and remained calm enough to save his life under the most desperate circumstances, and no doubtful gaze could ever take that truth away from her again. As for Grayson Kane, his life after that fateful night turned in a direction even he had never imagined, because when the empire his father had left him collapsed beneath the weight of investigations and confessions, when the uncle he had respected was exposed along with everyone who had betrayed him, he had nothing left to cling to except the truth of who he really was, and within the terrible silence of that loss, he began learning something a lifetime of power had never taught him: how to listen, how to hear the things money and fear had always smothered, how to listen to the quiet voice of conscience he had ignored for far too long. After that night, those two people didn't enter each other's lives in the way stories often promise. They didn't become a couple, and there were no beautiful declarations or romantic vows, because their worlds had always been separated by too great a distance, and each of them still carried wounds too deep to be easily healed. but between them remained an invisible bond they both understood, a quiet transformation each had awakened in the other, because she had taught him that kindness didn't need a voice to become something great, while he, through his letter and his acknowledgement of who she truly was, had taught her that she deserved to be seen, heard, and valued like every other human being. And perhaps that was the most precious gift two strangers could ever offer one another, not love in the ordinary sense, but the salvation of each other from the invisible prisons in which they had confined themselves for so long. The story of Delia and Grayson leaves us with a profound lesson about human dignity, that in a world that constantly rewards those who are the loudest, the most powerful, and the quickest to demand what they want, sometimes it is the quietest people, those whom society has grown accustomed to overlooking, as though they don't exist, who carry within themselves the greatest courage and the deepest kindness, and that a person's true worth is never measured by their position or the strength of their voice, but by the choices they make when no one is forcing them to do what is right. Their story reminds each of us to pause for a moment amid the rush of our lives and truly see the people who quietly move through our days, the people who serve us, the workers whose efforts often go unnoticed, and those who live with disabilities or difficult circumstances, because behind their silence there may be an entire world of thought and feeling, a courageous heart, and a dignity we have never taken the time to recognize, and sometimes even the smallest act of respect, even one sincere gaze that truly sees another person, can change an entire life. If this story has touched your heart in any way, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with the people you love, so that each day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories that move the human spirit. And we would truly love to hear your own reflections. How did Delia's story make you feel? Did you recognize within it any image from the real world around you? Have you ever unintentionally overlooked a quiet person who deserved more of your attention and care? Please leave a comment and share the thoughts resting deep within your heart, because every story you tell may become a source of inspiration and healing for someone else who is listening in silence. Thank you for spending your time with us and staying until the final words of today's story. May everyone watching this video always be blessed with good health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. We look forward to seeing you again in the stories ahead. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again soon.